The yellow haze started as a thin ribbon in the lowest part of the valley, but within hours, it had thickened into a heavy, shimmering tide. From the porch of his high-altitude cabin, Rick watched the familiar green landscape vanish beneath that sickly glow. The silence of the woods felt different now, heavy and suffocating, as if the forest itself were holding its breath before being submerged. He did not wait for the wind to shift. He knew the air down there was already a death sentence, and it was only a matter of time before the atmospheric pressure pushed the poison up to his front door. The world had changed so fast it felt like a fever dream. Only 48 hours ago, the sirens had wailed from the town 3,000 feet below, a distant, frantic sound that Rick had ignored at first, thinking it was just another industrial drill. Then the local emergency broadcasts went dead. Then the power lines hummed with a strange, high-pitched vibration before snapping into silence. By the time the first wisps of the fog appeared, there was no one left to call. He was alone, standing on the edge of a mountain that was quickly becoming an island in a sea of toxic gas. He moved with frantic, quiet efficiency, tossing his essential gear into bed of the truck while his 2 dogs watched from the porch, their ears pinned back in confusion. They could sense the shift in the air, the metallic tang that should not have been there. The dogs were his only shadows now, one a gray-muzzled shepherd mix with a permanent limp, the other a younger, leaner hound with eyes that never seemed to blink. They paced the length of the porch, whining low in their throats as they watched the yellow curtain rise. He realized he had to move even higher to stay above the shifting air currents. Rick grabbed his monocrystalline panels last, bolting them firmly to the roof racks of the truck to ensure he had a portable power source for his tools and lights once he reached the higher elevations. These panels were his lifeline. Without them, he would be sitting in the dark, unable to keep his gear running or his batteries charged in the long nights ahead. He handled them with a precision born of desperation, making sure the brackets were tight and the wiring was tucked away where the branches could not snag it. In a world where the power grid had dissolved into the mist, those silicon cells were more valuable than gold. The truck was packed until the suspension groaned. He had crates of canned food, a few gallons of fuel he had siphoned from the generator, and every tool he thought he might need to rebuild a life from scratch. He whistled for the dogs, and they did not need a second invitation. They leapt into the cab, crowding the passenger seat, their warm breath fogging up the glass. Rick climbed in behind the wheel, his hands shaking just enough for him to notice. He took a deep breath of the air, still clean, still smelling of pine and coal granite, and turned the key. As he pulled away from the cabin, the rearview mirror showed the yellow fog licking at the base of his driveway, swallowing the trees he had planted years ago. It was not like smoke. It was heavier, moving with a fluid, liquid grace that filled every depression in the earth. It did not dissipate. It just accumulated. He did not look back again. He shifted the truck into low gear and began the slow, grinding climb up the steep mountain tracks. The road was little more than a service trail for the old logging camps, a zigzagging path of loose shale and deep ruts. The truck's engine roared as it clawed for traction, the monocrystalline panels on the roof gleaming under the pale afternoon sun. Every 100 feet of elevation felt like a victory. He watched the altimeter on the dash with an intensity that bordered on obsession. 4,000 feet. 4,500. The weight of the silence outside was punctuated only by the gravel spraying against the wheel wells and the heavy panting of the dogs. Rick found himself checking the seals on the windows every few minutes, his mind playing tricks on him. He imagined he could smell the sulfurous rot of the chemicals, even though he knew he was still well above the danger zone. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He had to stay focused. One wrong turn on these crumbling ledges would send the truck, the dogs, and his entire future tumbling into the abyss. Above him, the peaks of the Sawtooth Range stood like jagged teeth against a sky that was still a piercing, mocking blue. He knew the geography of these mountains well, But he also knew that the fog was not bound by maps. It followed the thermal currents, the way the cold air settled into basins. As long as the sun was up, the heat might keep the fog pushed down, but once night fell and the temperatures plummeted, the tide would rise. He needed to find a spot that offered more than just height. He needed a fortress. The higher he climbed, the more the landscape changed. The thick pines gave way to stunted, wind-swept firs, and eventually to the bare, gray bones of the mountain. The air grew colder, thinner, catching in his lungs with a sharp bite. He stopped the truck at a high overlook to let the engine cool, the radiator hissing in the thin atmosphere. Stepping out, he looked back down the way he had come. The valley was gone. In its place was a flat, shimmering expanse of yellow that stretched to the horizon. It looked peaceful from this distance, like a calm lake at sunrise, but Rick knew that underneath that surface, everything was dying. The houses, the cars, the animals, all of it submerged in a corrosive, airless void. He stood there for a long time, the wind whipping his jacket against his frame, while the dog stood at his heels, staring down at the yellow world they had narrowly escaped. The sun began to dip behind the western ridges, casting long, purple shadows across the stone. The cooling air meant the fog would start to expand, its volume increasing as the temperature dropped. Rick climbed back into the truck, his joints stiff from the high-altitude chill. The engine kicked over with a reassuring rumble, a mechanical heartbeat in a world of silence. He pushed the truck further up the ridge, navigating by the dimming light reflected off the snow-capped peaks. He reached a plateau where the timberline had long since ended. Here, the wind was a constant, howling presence, but the air was crystalline and sharp. He parked the truck behind a massive granite outcropping to shield it from the gusts that threatened to tip the top-heavy vehicle. The dogs hopped out, sniffing at the frozen dirt and looking toward the abyss of yellow below. They stayed close to his legs, refusing to wander more than a few feet into the darkening wilderness. Rick began setting up his camp for the night. He did not use his tent. The truck was the only place he felt safe, a metal shell against an uncertain world. He checked the connections on his monocrystalline panels one last time, ensuring they would be ready to drink in the first light of dawn to recharge the auxiliary batteries. He fed the dogs from a can of beef stew, sharing half of his own portion with them as they sat together in the cramped cab. The heat from their bodies was the only thing keeping the cabin warm as the mercury dropped. The night was a test of psychological endurance. Every time the truck rocked in a particularly strong gust of wind, Rick woke with a start, his heart hammering against his ribs. Thinking the fog had finally reached him, he watched the sensors he had jerry-rigged to the exterior, monitoring the air quality with a small digital readout. The light remained a steady green, signifying clean oxygen, but the barometric pressure was dropping steadily. Downstairs in the world it used to be, the yellow tide was likely cresting the foothills, filling every canyon and coulee. By 3 a.m, the moon rose, a pale sliver that illuminated the sea of fog below. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. The mist seemed to glow with an internal phosphorescence, swirling in slow, hypnotic patterns. Rick realized then that he could never go back. There was no waiting this out in a week or a month. The chemicals were too heavy to evaporate and too stable to break down in the atmosphere. This was the new floor of the world. He spent the remaining hours of darkness studying his topographic maps by a dim LED light, his eyes burning from exhaustion. He needed a permanent solution. Roaming the ridges in a truck would only work as long as his fuel and tires held out, and both were finite. He needed something deeper, something made of stone that could withstand the elements and the creeping gas. His finger traced the contour lines of the highest peaks until he found a promising lead. An old mining district, and near it, a site marked with the stark, blocky letters of a restricted government zone. As the first hint of gray light touched the eastern horizon, Rick started the engine. The monocrystalline panels began their silent work, the voltage meter ticking upward as the sun crested the distant peaks. He looked at his dogs, patted the dashboard of the truck with a gloved hand, and began the final ascent toward the highest reaches of the range. He was a man living on borrowed time, chasing a horizon that was shrinking by the hour, but as long as he had the high ground and the sun, he had a chance. The altitude was beginning to affect both him and the dogs. The shepherd, Silas, was panting harder than usual, and Rick felt a dull, persistent ache behind his eyes. He reached for a bottle of water, sipping it slowly to stay hydrated. He could not afford to get sick or disoriented now. The road ahead was narrow and crumbled in places where the winter snows had washed away the shoulder. To his right, a sheer drop fell away into the clouds of yellow. One slip of the tires, and the story would end right here on this nameless slope. He reached a fork in the trail that was not on his primary map. To the left, the path ascended sharply toward a jagged summit that seemed to touch the stars. To the right, it leveled off, skirting the edge of a massive granite bowl. Rick checked his compass and his GPS, though the latter was struggling to find a signal in the deep canyons. Instinct told him to keep climbing. The higher the altitude, the more time he would have if the weather patterns shifted. He chose the left path, the truck's tires spitting stones as it struggled against the incline. The engine temperature gauge began to climb, the needle inching toward the red zone. Rick had to pull over several times to let the coolant circulate, standing in the biting wind while he watched the sun track across the sky. Time was his greatest enemy. He needed to reach the restricted site before the next pressure system moved in. By late afternoon, the terrain leveled out into a high, desolate basin. The ground here was nothing but shattered stone and patches of stubborn lichen. In the center of the basin stood a series of low, concrete structures, half buried in the mountainside. Rick felt a surge of hope. This was it. This was the place that might offer him a sanctuary above the tide. He drove toward the largest building, his eyes scanning for any sign of life. But the area was as dead as the valley below. He parked the truck in front of a massive iron door, the dogs pressing their noses against the glass as they barked at the strange, silent structures. Rick climbed out, his legs feeling heavy and clumsy in the thin air. He approached the door, noticing the faded markings of a long-defunct government agency. It was cold, silent, and solid. He reached for the handle, wondering if the world inside was as empty as the world outside. The air here was so thin it barely felt like anything at all, yet it was pure. He took a deep, shaky breath and looked one last time at the yellow horizon far below. He was Rick, he had his dogs, and he had his power. Now, he just needed a door that would stay shut. He began the process of checking the facility, knowing that this was only the beginning of a much longer struggle to stay alive in a world that had forgotten how to breathe. The iron door of the facility was cold and indifferent, a slab of reinforced metal that had weathered decades of mountain storms. Rick stood before it, his breath coming in short, ragged plumes in the thin air. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since he reached the plateau, and the wind was beginning to pick up, whistling through the jagged granite spires like a chorus of ghosts. Behind him, Silas and the younger hound remained in the cab of the truck, their silhouettes dark against the glass as they watched his every move. He reached out and cleared a layer of frost from the heavy latch, finding the metal pitted but still structurally sound. This was a restricted site he had seen on the map, an abandoned Cold War-era bunker built deep into the granite of the peak. It was a relic of a time when the world feared a different kind of cloud, but for Rick, it was the only chance he had left. With a grunt of exertion, Rick threw his weight against the handle. The mechanism groaned, a sound of metal screaming against metal that echoed across the silent basin. But eventually, the seal broke. A puff of stale, dry air escaped from the interior, smelling of dust, old grease, and copper. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from his belt. clicking it on to reveal a long, concrete tunnel that sloped downward into the heart of the mountain. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating walls that were thick with the grime of neglected decades. It was the perfect sanctuary from chemicals, a place where the weight of the earth itself acted as a shield. Here, the air did not move. It sat heavy and still, undisturbed by the atmospheric tides that were currently drowning the world below. He spent the next several hours moving with a sense of urgent purpose. The physical toll of the altitude was becoming more apparent with every movement. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, and his lungs felt as though they could never quite pull enough oxygen from the thin, biting air. He backed the truck as close to the entrance as possible, the monocrystalline panels on the roof catching the last golden rays of the sun. He began the grueling process of hauling his supplies into the concrete depths. Every crate of canned food, every toolkit, and every gallon of water had to be moved by hand. He felt the burn in his thighs and shoulders, a steady ache that reminded him he was no longer a young man. But the sight of the yellow fog creeping up the lower slopes, a distant, glowing carpet of death, kept him moving when his body screamed for him to stop. The dogs were hesitant at first. They stood at the threshold of the bunker, their noses twitching as they processed a scent of stagnant air and old oil. Silas, the older shepherd mix, looked up at Rick with a questioning tilt of his head, his gray muzzle quivering. The younger hound was more restless, pacing the dirt outside and looking back toward the truck. Rick whistled low, a command they both knew, and they finally crossed a line. Their claws clicked nervously on the cold concrete floor as they followed him deeper into the dark. Rick found a side chamber that had likely served as a barracks or a duty officer's quarters and laid down a few heavy wool blankets for them. "Stay," he commanded, his voice sounding hollow and strange in the vault-like space. The dogs circled twice before settling down, their eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight as they adjusted to the silence. He needed them safe and out of the way while he inspected the most critical part of the bunker, the ventilation system. Deep in the back of the facility, behind a set of double steel doors, he found the machine room. It was a forest of rusted pipes and heavy iron blowers that looked like sleeping giants. He wiped the dust off a brass plate that detailed the air filtration specifications. The system was designed to scrub radiation and biological agents, utilizing a series of charcoal and HEPA stages. It was a marvel of mid-century engineering, but was old, decades past its service life. He opened one of the filter housings, and the smell of rot hit him instantly. The internal elements had long since crumbled into a black, powdery mess. He knew that if the wind shifted and pushed the chemical fog up the mountain, these ancient filters would be useless. They might stop the soot, but they wouldn't stop the microscopic chemical chains of the yellow mist. The thought of the fog leaking through the vents while he and the dogs slept sent a cold shiver down his spine. He spent the evening mapping out the bunker's layout by the light of a headlamp. It was a labyrinth of utility corridors, storage rooms, and living quarters. He found a map of the internal wiring behind a cracked glass frame and realized he could bypass the main generator, which was surely seized with age and lacked fuel, and hook his monocrystalline panels directly into the emergency lighting circuit. It would take tedious work, stripping old wires and soldering new connections, but he could bring the bunker back to life. He worked into the night, the silence of the mountain occasionally broken by the clatter of his tools against the floor. Every wire he connected felt like a victory over the void. As the temperature outside plummeted toward zero, Rick returned to the truck one last time to retrieve the remaining batteries. Looking back toward the horizon from the bunker entrance, he saw that the yellow tide had risen significantly. It was no longer a distant pool. It was a rising ocean, claiming the higher ridges and filling the canyons like liquid gold under the moonlight. The silence of the mountain was absolute, broken only by the thin, high-pitched whistle of the wind through the rocks. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a realization that he was likely the only living soul for hundreds of miles. There were no lights on the horizon, no signals in the sky. He was a man standing on a rock, watching the world end in silence. Back inside, he heaved the heavy iron door shut and turned the locking wheel until it clicked into place with a final, echoing thud. The sound of the bolts sliding home provided a momentary sense of peace. For the first time in days, he was not looking over his shoulder for the fog. He returned to the barracks room and sat on the floor with Silas and the hound. They leaned their warm, heavy heads against his lap, seeking comfort in the dark. Rick pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began to sketch a plan for a more permanent and clean air supply. He knew he could not just hide in a hole and hope the seals held. He had to find a way to make this tomb a home. He needed plants. He needed a way to produce his own oxygen. Sleep did not come easily. The mountains seemed to groan around him, the granite shifting under the immense pressure of the cooling earth. Rick lay awake, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the dogs and the faint, distant hum of the wind outside. He thought about the world he had left behind, the cabin, the trees, the small-town pharmacy where he used to get his coffee. They were all gone now, replaced by a yellow void that did not care about history or human effort. He wondered if anyone else had found a high enough peak, or if he was truly the last witness. By morning, the interior of the bunker was freezing, the concrete walls radiating a deep, bone-chilling cold. Rick climbed out of his sleeping bag, his joints stiff and clicking, and made his way to the machine room. He spent hours dismantling the intake valves, cleaning away years of grit and corrosion with a wire brush. He used the tools he had salvaged to patch the seals on the primary vents, but the material was brittle and cracked under his fingers. He needed better supplies, industrial-grade gaskets, and more robust filtration media. He realized that to survive here long-term, he would eventually have to make a choice. He would have to descend back toward the fog line to scavenge what the old world had left behind. He spent the afternoon setting up the wiring for his monocrystalline panels. He mounted the controllers on the wall near the entrance, running the thick copper lines through a narrow gap in the door frame. He used a sealant to fill the space around the wires, making it as airtight as possible. When the sun finally hit the panels outside, the small LED lights on the controller flickered from red to green. A few of the overhead lights in the tunnel hummed and flickered to life, casting a dim, yellowish glow over the concrete. It was not much, but it was a start. It was a sign that he could still bend the world to his will. Rick sat on a crate, watching the dogs explore the newly lit hallway. They seemed more relaxed now, their tails wagging tentatively as they sniffed at the corners. He opened a can of peaches and shared them with the dogs, the sweet syrup a stark contrast to the metallic, dusty air of the bunker. He looked at the heavy door, then at the map on the wall. He was safer now, but the mountain was a harsh mistress, and the fog was patient. He would spend the next few days reinforcing his sanctuary, preparing for the day the wind would inevitably turn against him. He was the master of a granite kingdom, and though his subjects were few, he intended to keep them alive. As the second day came to a close, Rick began to organize the storage rooms. He found a section that had been used for emergency rations, though most of the containers had been looted or had rotted away decades ago. However, the shelving was sturdy and made of galvanized steel. He began moving his own supplies onto these shelves, categorizing them by priority. Medical supplies, water purification tablets, and high-calorie fats were placed in the most accessible spots. He worked with meticulousness that kept his mind from wandering to the dark thoughts that lurked in the corners of his consciousness. In the corner of one of the lower-level storage rooms, he found a crate that had been overlooked. Prying it open with a crowbar, he found a dozen heavy-duty respirators and several boxes of unopened filter canisters. They were old, but they were vacuum-sealed in thick plastic. He felt a surge of relief. This would make his eventual scavenging trips much safer. He also found a set of yellow hazmat suits, though the rubber was stiff and would need to be tested for leaks. He laid them out on a table, treating them with the reverence one might show to a religious relic. These were his tickets to the world below. That night, the wind outside turned into a full-scale gale. Even through the feet of solid granite, Rick could hear the low, thrumming vibration of the mountain. He checked the air quality sensor he had placed near the intake. The levels were still safe, but the pressure was fluctuating wildly. He realized that the bunker's original design relied on a positive pressure system to keep contaminants out, a system that required the main fans to be running. Without those fans, he was relying entirely on the physical seals of the doors and vents. He spent the rest of the night sitting by the entrance, a wrench in his hand, listening for the sound of air whistling through a gap. Silas stayed by his side, the dog's ears twitching at sounds Rick couldn't even hear. The bond between them had deepened in these few days of crisis. They were no longer just a man and his pet, but two survivors bound by a shared fate. Rick realized that he wasn't just working for his own life anymore. He had to keep the lights on for the dogs, too. As the sun rose on the third day, Rick looked at his monocrystalline panels through the small, thick observation port in the door. They were covered in a fine layer of frost, but as the light hit them, they began to clear. He watched the voltage climb on his monitor, a small digital heartbeat that told him he had power for another day. He knew what he had to do next. He had to plan the descent. He needed the greenhouse. He needed a way to turn this cold, gray tomb into a place where life could actually grow, not just hide. He looked at the dogs, patted the cold concrete wall, and began to prep his gear for the first dive into the yellow void. The morning of the descent brought a sky the color of bruised slate. Rick stood at the heavy iron threshold of the bunker, looking down at the world he was about to enter. From this height, the yellow fog looked like a solid floor, a deceptive surface that had the ruins of civilization beneath a toxic, shimmering blanket. He knew the town of Oakhaven lay directly below this ridge, nestled in a bowl that would have trapped the chemicals like a basin. It was a hazardous journey, but the discovery of the old hazmat suits in the bunker storage room had changed the math of his survival. He could not stay in this stone tomb forever without a way to breathe, and the industrial greenhouse kit he had seen in the shipping manifest of the Oakhaven Distribution Center was the only way to turn the bunker into a living ecosystem. The preparation was a ritual of survival that took hours. In the silent, echoing hallway of the bunker, Rick laid out the scavenged suit. The rubber was stiff, smelling of ozone and decades of stale air. He checked every seam, every zipper, and the integrity of the visor with a magnifying glass. He spent an hour applying a specialized silicone lubricant to the gaskets of the respirator, ensuring a perfect seal. One pinhole leak in the corrosive environment below would mean a slow, agonizing death as the chemicals turned his lungs into liquid. He felt the weight of his isolation more than ever as he worked. There was no backup, no one to pull him out if his equipment failed. It was just him, his tools, and the heavy, indifferent silence of the granite walls. The dogs knew something was wrong. Silas sat near the truck, his head cocked to the side, while the younger hound paced the perimeter of the bunker entrance, his claws clicking rhythmically on the concrete. They watched Rick as he climbed into the bulky yellow suit. The material crinkled loudly in the thin air, a harsh, unnatural sound that made the dogs growl low in their throats. When he pulled the hood over his head and tightened the straps of the mask, he transformed into something unrecognizable, a faceless, rubberized creature from a nightmare. He knelt to pat Silas's head, but the dog flinched at the chemical smell of the treated rubber. "Stay here." Rick's voice came out muffled and mechanical behind the filters. "Keep the bunker safe. I will be back before the sun hits the western ridge." He backed the truck out of the granite alcove, the monocrystalline panels on the roof reflecting the dull, gray light of the overcast morning. The descent was a slow-motion nightmare of low visibility and crumbling mountain roads. As he lost altitude, the air began to change. The crisp, biting cold of the peak gave way to a muggy, stagnant heat that seemed to vibrate with sickly energy. Wisps of yellow mist began to lick at the tires, then the hood, until the truck was fully submerged in the tide. The world turned to monochromatic, sickly amber. The sunlight was filtered through the dense chemicals, creating a subterranean glow that made it impossible to judge distances or the depth of the potholes in the road. Rick switched on the heavy-duty fog lights, but the beams only traveled a few feet before being swallowed by the soup. He drove by feel and memory, keeping the passenger side tires hugged against the mountain wall. The chemicals were indeed corrosive. He could hear a faint, persistent fizzing sound, like 1,000 tiny needles, as the mist reacted with the metal and glass of the truck. He reached the outskirts of Oakhaven by mid-morning. The town was a graveyard of abandoned dreams. Cars sat frozen in the middle of the road, their paint stripped and bubbled by the acidic air. Storefront signs had melted, the plastic dripping like wax onto the cracked, yellow-stained sidewalks. There were no bodies. Anything organic had likely been dissolved or buried under the settling sediment of the fog, but the absence of life was a physical weight that pressed against the cab of the truck. The hardware distribution center was a massive, corrugated metal structure on the north side of town. Rick pulled the truck up to the loading docks, the engine idling with a ragged, uneven chug as the air filters struggled with a heavy, tainted atmosphere. He stepped out of the cab, and the world immediately felt alien. The fog pressed against his suit like a physical weight, a thick, humid pressure that made every movement feel like he was walking underwater. Every breath through the respirator was a labored effort, the intake valves clicking rhythmically in his ears. He grabbed a heavy crowbar and a winch cable from the truck bed and approached the massive rolling doors of the warehouse. The silence inside the distribution center was absolute and terrifying. High above, the yellow mist seeped through the skylights, hanging in long, ghostly curtains between the rows of industrial shelving. Rick's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, reflecting off the steel skeletons of the racks. He moved toward the back, where the heavy shipping containers were staged for transport. His boots made a wet, sucking sound on the floor, which was covered in a layer of yellow grime that had the consistency of wet flour. He found the manifest board near the foreman's office and scanned the fading ink with a trembling hand. There was Container 402, Industrial Greenhouse Kit, Apex Series. He found the container at the far end of the bay, tucked behind a stack of rusted engine blocks. It was a massive steel box, bolted shut and weathered by the initial blast of the disaster. Rick set to work with the crowbar, his breath hitching in his chest. The suit was hot and claustrophobic, the interior becoming slick with his own sweat. After a frantic struggle that left him gasping for air, the locking bars gave way with a piercing screech of metal that seemed to echo forever in the hollow warehouse. He swung the doors open, and his flashlight revealed the prize. Inside were crates of tempered glass panels, heavy aluminum struts, and rolls of high-pressure sealants. This was not just a garden. It was an industrial-grade environmental shield, designed for extreme climates. The task of moving the crates was monumental. Each one weighed hundreds of pounds, and he had to use a manual pallet jack to wheel them toward the loading dock. He moved slowly, his vision tunneling from the physical exertion and the lack of oxygen in the cramped mask. Every time he moved a crate, he had to stop and lean against the cold steel of the container, his forehead pressed against the inside of his visor, waiting for his heart rate to drop. He thought of the bunker, the cold stone floors, and the dogs waiting for him. He thought of the bees he still needed to find. That was the only thing that kept his hands moving when his muscles wanted to give up. He spent 4 hours in that silent, corrosive haze. He winched the heavy crates onto his trailer one by one, securing them with heavy-duty ratcheting straps until they were immobile. The metal of the trailer hissed as the fog began to eat into the fresh scratches made by the heavy crates. He was exhausted, his muscles trembling with fatigue, but he could not stop. He found a secondary crate containing the industrial ventilation fans and the solar-compatible battery banks that would integrate with his monocrystalline panels. He added them to the load. Knowing every piece was a brick in the wall, he was building against the end of the world. As he prepared to leave, a shift in the fog revealed a row of smaller containers hidden in the shadows. On a whim, he cracked one open and found crates of organic soil and thousands of heirloom seeds stored in vacuum-sealed packets. It was a treasure trove of life. He shoved as many bags of soil as he could into the remaining gaps on the trailer, his movements becoming frantic as the light outside began to dim. He knew the atmospheric pressure would change as the sun set, potentially making the fog even denser and more dangerous for his ascent. He climbed back into the truck, his gloved hands fumbling with the ignition. The engine groaned, sputtered, and finally caught, though it sounded rougher than before. He began the long, slow crawl back out of the valley, navigating the ruined streets with the caution of a man carrying his entire future on a single trailer. The truck felt incredibly heavy, the trailer swaying behind him as he turned corners. The climb back up the mountain was even more treacherous than the descent. The engine temperature rose dangerously high as it fought to pull the added weight into the thin, oxygen-poor air. Rick watched the gauges with desperate intensity, praying the cooling system would not fail in the middle of a toxic cloud. Every mile felt like a marathon. The road seemed narrower now, the edges softened by the accumulating yellow dust. At one point, the trailer tires slipped on a patch of loose shale, and for a heart-stopping second, Rick felt the weight of the greenhouse kit trying to pull the truck backward into the abyss. He slammed the gear into a lower range, the engine screaming as it clawed for traction. He didn't breathe until he felt the tires grab solid rock again. As he crested the final ridge, the yellow fog began to thin. The transition was abrupt and beautiful. One moment he was submerged in the amber void, and the next he broke through the surface into the clear, purple light of dusk. He stopped the truck and sat there for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. He pulled the respirator from his face, and the first breath of clean, cold mountain air was so sweet it made his lungs ache with relief. He looked at his hands. The yellow suit was covered in a fine, caustic dust that he would have to wash off with extreme care before entering the bunker. He reached the plateau just as the last of the light vanished behind the peaks. The dogs were there to meet him, barking at the truck from the safety of the bunker entrance, their tails blurring in the darkness. Rick climbed out of the suit, leaving it in a dedicated hot zone he had established just inside the door to prevent contamination. He felt as though he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon, his body battered and his nerves frayed. But as he looked at the massive crates on the trailer, gleaming under the moon, he knew the risk had been worth it. He had the glass, he had the steel, and he had the seeds. He had the components of a future. He walked into the bunker, Silas leaning his heavy head against his leg. And for the first time since the sirens had wailed, he felt a flicker of something that was not just survival. He felt like he was starting to build a world. He spent the remaining hours of the night unloading the most sensitive items, the seeds and the electronics, into the bunker's climate control storage. The physical labor was still exhausting, but the adrenaline of his success carried him through. He sat on the floor of the barracks, sharing a final meal with his dogs. The bunker was no longer just a hole in the ground. It was becoming a warehouse for a new beginning. He looked at his maps, plotting the next phase. He had the structure, but a greenhouse without pollinators was just a glass box of dying plants. Tomorrow, he would look for the bees. He closed his eyes, the sound of the wind outside no longer a threat, but a reminder that he was still high above the reach of the yellow tide. The morning after the deep dive into Oakhaven, Rick awoke to a body that felt as though it had been beaten with stones. Every joint in his hands ached from gripping the steering wheel and the heavy crowbar, and his lungs felt heavy, a lingering psychological remnant of the claustrophobic hours spent inside the rubber suit. He sat on the edge of his makeshift cot in the back of the bunker, watching the dim light of the overhead LED flicker in the damp air. The power from the monocrystalline panels was holding steady, the voltage monitor showing a healthy charge, but the weight of the tasks ahead felt more crushing than the mountain itself. He had the greenhouse kit, but as he looked at the crates sitting on the trailer outside to the thick observation port, he realized that a glass house without life was just a transparent tomb. He needed more than just seeds and soil. He needed a workforce that could manage the complex, invisible dance of pollination. Without them, the thousands of heirloom seeds he had salvaged would produce nothing but foliage, and eventually, the oxygen levels in the sealed bunker will begin to fail. He spent the first few hours of the day performing a post-trip inspection of the truck. The yellow dust from the valley had settled into every microscopic crevice of the chassis, and he could already see the early, terrifying signs of pitting on the aluminum rims. The fog was not just a gas. It was an active, hungry chemical agent. He used a pressurized sprayer filled with a neutralizing alkaline solution to wash down the vehicle and the trailer, watching the yellow runoff sizzle and foam as it hit the granite ground. He was meticulous, moving the nozzle in slow, overlapping passes, knowing that bringing even a trace of that corrosive grit into the bunker could compromise the seals he had worked so hard to establish. The dog stayed back, sensing his intense focus, though Silas eventually crept forward to nudge Rick's hand, offering a silent reminder that he was not alone in this endeavor. The silence of the plateau was absolute, broken only by the hiss of the sprayer and the distant, rhythmic thrum of the wind. Once the truck was cleaned and the gear stowed, Rick began to trek back down the southern ridge, though not nearly as deep as he had gone the day before. He was scouting the transition zone, the area just above the current fog line where the air was still breathable, but the vegetation was starting to feel the stress of the changing atmosphere. He moved on foot this time, leaving the truck at a higher overlook to avoid wasting precious fuel. He carried a specialized mesh box he had constructed from scavenged materials in the bunker, along with a smoker's kit he had found in his cabin supplies. He was looking for bees. He knew that if any survived, they would be clinging to the last of the high-altitude flora, trapped between the encroaching poison and the barren, frozen peaks above. The search was grueling and required a level of patience that Rick felt he was rapidly losing. The higher altitudes were typically too cold and windswept for most hives, but he knew of a specific southern-facing cliff face where wild swarms had nested for years in the hollows of the limestone. He navigated the narrow goat paths, his eyes scanning every crevice and fissure of the granite. The silence of the mountain was eerie and unnatural. Usually, these slopes hummed with the sound of insects, the rustle of small rodents, and the calls of high-country birds. But today, the only sound was the muffled roar of the wind and the crunch of his own boots on the shale. The world felt suspended, as if nature itself were holding its breath, waiting for the yellow tide to finish its slow, inexorable work. After 4 hours of climbing and scanning, his eyes caught a flicker of movement near a deep fissure in a limestone outcropping. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, and held his breath to keep from startling the scouts. There, hovering around a narrow opening, were several bees. They were smaller than the commercial honeybees he was used to, rugged, dark-furred, and clearly adapted to the harsh mountain climate. He watched them for a long time, realizing with a heavy heart that these insects were effectively trapped. The fog had risen enough to cut off their traditional foraging grounds in the lower meadows. They were starving, desperately clinging to the last few wildflowers that managed to bloom in the thin, rocky soil of the heights. They were the last of their kind in this range, a tiny pocket of life on the edge of a vast, yellow abyss. Rick moved with the deliberate slowness of a man who understood the stakes. If he failed to secure this hive, his greenhouse would fail. If he was too aggressive, he would kill the very thing he was trying to save. He set up his smoker, using dried pine needles and a bit of burlap he had soaked in a mild sugar solution. The goal was not to harm them, but to induce a state of lethargy that would allow him to transport the entire colony without inciting a defensive swarm that could lead to their deaths or his own injury. As the thin blue smoke drifted into the crevice, he felt a strange, sharp pang of guilt. He was essentially kidnapping the last of a species, taking them from their ancestral home and locking them in a glass box. But as he looked down at the shimmering yellow void below, he knew that their only other option was a slow, agonizing extinction as the fog continued its ascent. The process of extracting the hive was a delicate surgery performed with a small pry bar and a soft bristle brush. He worked for nearly 3 hours in the biting wind, carefully widening the fissure and gently coaxing the clusters of bees into the mesh transport box. He found the queen, a long, elegant heart of the hive, and made sure she was secure first. Once she was in the box, the rest of the swarm followed her scent, a living river of gold and black flowing into the cage. He sealed the box and wrapped it in a heavy wool blanket to keep them warm against a high-altitude chill, feeling the warmth of the colony through the fabric. The hike back to the truck was the most nerve-wracking mile of his life. Every slip on the loose rock, every stumble on a hidden root threatened to jar the hive and kill the queen. He held the box against his chest like a holy relic, shielding it from the gusts of wind that threatened to knock him off the narrow path. The dogs met him at the overlook, their tails wagging tentatively as they sniffed at the strange, humming package in his arms. Silas let out a short, sharp bark of curiosity, but Rick hushed him immediately. He didn't stop to rest. He loaded the hive into the cab of the truck, placed it on the floorboards where he could keep the heater on low, ensuring the bees didn't go into a fatal chill during the final leg of the journey. As he drove back toward the bunker, he stopped at a high point to look out over the valley. The fog had moved again. It wasn't just sitting in the basins anymore. It was beginning to pulse and swell, pushed by a new high-pressure system moving in from the west. The yellow line was visibly higher than it had been that morning, swallowing several ridges that had been clear only hours ago. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that his timing had been perfect. Another day, and this limestone cliff might have been submerged in the tide. He was racing an ocean that never tired, and he was only winning by inches. Back at the bunker, he didn't immediately move the hive inside. Instead, he placed the box in a sheltered, shadowed alcove near the main entrance where he planned to build a greenhouse. He knew that the transition from the wild air to the pressurized, recycled environment of the bunker would be a shock that could kill the colony. He spent the evening setting up a temporary feeding station for them, mixing a heavy syrup of organic sugar and water he had salvaged from his cabin. As he watched the first few bees emerge in the mesh to drink, their wings beating a frantic rhythm, he felt a profound and heavy sense of responsibility. These were not just insects anymore. They were his partners, his tiny, winged laborers who held the key to his continued existence. The realization hit him then, as he sat in the dark with the humming hive and his 2 dogs. The greenhouse over the bunker entrance was no longer just a project. It was a necessity for survival of this entire microcosm. The bees would pollinate the crops would provide oxygen for the bunker and food for him, and the dogs would provide the companionship that kept his mind from fracturing in the silence. It was a closed loop of life, a tiny, fragile bubble of defiance against a world that had turned toxic. If any one part of the chain failed, the rest would crumble. He looked at Silas, who was resting his chin on Rick's boot, and felt a surge of protectiveness that bordered on desperation. He spent the rest of the night in the bunker's machine room, poring over the assembly instructions for the Apex Series greenhouse. The struts were heavy, cold-rolled aluminum, and the glass panels were massive, tempered sheets designed to withstand hurricane-force winds. He would have to build a crane system using the truck's winch and a series of pulleys to lift the components into place over the bunker's main hatch. He calculated the weight loads and the pressure seals, his mind working through the engineering challenges with a clarity he hadn't felt since before the sirens. The presence of the hive had given him a new, sharp sense of urgency. He couldn't leave them in the box forever. They needed the greenhouse as much as he did. Before he finally allowed himself to sleep, Rick walked to the heavy iron door and looked out through the observation port. The moon was high and cold, casting a silver, ghostly light over the yellow sea below. It looked like a different planet, beautiful, silent, and utterly hostile to everything he was. He turned back to the warmth of the bunker, where the dogs were already snoring on their blankets. The hive was silent now. The bees huddled together in a tight ball for warmth. Rick laid his hand on the cold stone wall, feeling the immense, ancient strength of the mountain. He was alone in the world, the last man on the last peak, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was just waiting for the end. He was preparing for the beginning. He closed his eyes, the faint, comforting hum of the bees still echoing in his mind, and slept a deep, dreamless sleep. As the hours passed in the darkness, he dreamed of green leaves and the smell of wet earth. He dreamed of a world where the yellow fog didn't exist, where he could walk the trails without a mask and listen to birds without wondering if they were the last ones. In his sleep, he saw the greenhouse finished, a shining beacon of glass and light on the edge of the granite cliff. He saw the bees flying through blossoms of tomato plants and squash, their golden bodies dusted with pollen. It was a vision of hope that felt more real than the concrete walls around him. He woke up before dawn, the air in the bunker feeling crisp and still. He knew that today was the day the construction had to begin. He got up quietly, trying not to wake the dogs, and made a pot of strong coffee on the small electric burner. As he sipped the hot liquid, he looked at his monocrystalline panels on the monitor. They were already beginning to catch the first faint light of the rising sun. Rick took a deep breath, tasted the pine and the granite, and prepared to face the mountain one more time. The sky above the Sawtooth Range did not turn blue as the sun climbed. Instead, it took on a bruised, muddy quality that signaled a massive shift in atmospheric pressure. Rick stood on the granite plateau, his eyes fixed on the barometer he had mounted near the bunker's iron door. The needle was dropping with terrifying speed. He didn't need the instrument to tell him what was coming. He could feel the change in his sinuses and hear the way the wind had shifted from a clean whistle to a low, ominous thrum. Below him, the yellow sea was no longer calm. It was churning, pushed upward by a cold front that was acting like a giant squeegee, forcing the toxic fog out of canyons and up toward the only dry land left. He knew he was out of time. The assembly of the greenhouse, which he had hoped to take days to complete, now had to be finished in hours. He whistled for Silas and the hound, ushering them into the safety of the bunker's inner corridor. They sensed the urgency in his movements and retreated without protest, their tails tucked as they retreated into the shadows of the concrete. Rick turned back to the skeleton of the greenhouse. The aluminum ribs were bolted firmly into the rock, but they were currently nothing more than a cage. Without the glass, the fog would simply roll over the hatch and find its way into the bunker's aging intake vents. He grabbed the suction cup handles used for glasswork and moved toward the first heavy crate. The labor was grueling and singular. Each pane of tempered glass was thick and deceptively heavy, catching the rising wind like a sail. Rick worked with feverish intensity, his muscles screaming as he lifted the first panel into the base track. He used the truck's winch to provide a steady countertension, preventing the wind from shattering the glass against the granite. As he slid the first pane into the aluminum grooves, he applied a thick bead of industrial sealant he had scavenged from Oakhaven. The smell of the chemicals was sharp, but it was a scent of progress. He moved to the next frame, then the next, his movements becoming a rhythmic blur of lifting, seating, and sealing. By midday, the yellow mist was no longer a distant threat. It was visible as a roiling wall of amber just 500 feet below the plateau. The sunlight hitting the fog created a strange, diffused glow that made it difficult to judge the orientation of the glass. Rick's hands were raw, the grit of the mountain and the sticky residue of the sealant coating his skin. He reached for the solar controllers, wiring the monocrystalline panels into the greenhouse's dedicated heating and ventilation grid. These panels, the dark silicon hearts of his power system, were now the only thing that would keep the air inside the glass from stagnating or freezing. He could see the charge levels on his digital readout. The sun was being obscured by the rising haze, but the monocrystalline cells were still pulling enough energy to keep the systems humming. The wind intensified, bringing with it the first faint metallic tang of the approaching fog. Rick scrambled to the roof of the structure. Secured by a safety line to the truck's bumper, he was installing the apex vents, the small, automated windows that would allow for pressure regulation. His heart hammered against his ribs, not just from the exertion, but from the sight of the trees at the edge of the plateau vanishing into the yellow void. The fog was moving with a fluid, liquid grace, filling the depressions in the rock and licking at the tires of his truck. He slammed the last vent into place and began the final seal of the roof peak. As he worked, he had to keep a constant eye on the temporary hive box. The bees were agitated, their collective hum audible even over the wind. They could feel the pressure drop, their instincts screaming at them to find cover. Rick knew that if he didn't finish the greenhouse before the fog reached the box, the colony would be wiped out in minutes. He reached the bottom row of panels, the ones that would connect the greenhouse to the bunker's main hatch. He had fashioned a custom airlock door using a reinforced steel frame and thick rubber gaskets. It was a heavy, awkward piece of engineering, and it took every ounce of his remaining strength to hoist it into position. The first wisp of yellow mist reached the edge of the greenhouse foundation just as he tightened the final expansion bolt. The gas reacted with a fresh sealant, causing a faint, bubbling hiss that Rick ignored as he lunged for the hive. He grabbed the mesh box, cradling it against his chest, and dove through the airlock door into the greenhouse. He slammed the door shut and spun the locking wheel, the seals groaning as they compressed. For a moment, he simply collapsed against the glass, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He watched through the transparent wall as the world outside turned a solid, opaque yellow. The sun vanished, replaced by a dim, sickly luminescence that permeated the glass. The greenhouse was now a pressurized bubble of life on the roof of a dead world. Rick stood up, his legs shaking, and looked around the interior. The air was still clear, smelling of aluminum and the sweet syrup he had left for the bees. He could hear the hum of the ventilation fans, powered by the monocrystalline panels on the roof, as they began to circulate the air and maintain the internal pressure. The positive pressure was critical. It ensured that if there were any microscopic leaks in the seals, the clean air would push out, preventing the toxic fog from seeping in. He walked to the bunker hatch, which was now safely housed within the glass structure, and opened it. The dogs were waiting at the bottom of the ladder. When Silas saw Rick without his hazmat suit, the dog let out a jubilant yelp, leaping up to lick his face. Rick sat on the top rung, pulling both dogs into a tight embrace. The silence inside the greenhouse was a stark contrast to the howling wind he had just escaped. It was a cathedral of glass, a sanctuary where the rules of the new world didn't apply. He spent the next hour carefully releasing the bees from their transport box. They emerged tentatively at first, but soon they were circling the interior of the greenhouse, their golden bodies catching the dim, amber light from outside. He began the process of moving the soil and the seeds he had scavenged into the raised beds he had pre-built. He worked slowly now, the immediate danger having passed. He filled the beds with the rich, dark earth, the smell of it filling the greenhouse and providing a grounding contrast to the metallic air of the bunker. He planted the first of the heirloom seeds, tomatoes, squash, and hardy greens, tucking them into the soil with a tenderness that surprised him. These plants were more than just food. They were his oxygen scrubbers, his companions in the long isolation to come. As night fell over the mountain, Rick sat in a folding chair he had moved into the greenhouse. He didn't turn on the lights. He simply watched the yellow void outside. The fog pressed against the glass, a swirling, restless ocean of poison that seemed to be searching for a way in. But the monocrystalline panels had done their job during the day, filling the battery banks with enough power to keep the heaters and fans running through the dark. He could feel the warmth radiating from the small electric heaters, a cozy heat that smelled of hope. The dogs curled up at his feet, finally relaxed. The bees had settled into a corner of the structure, forming a quiet, humming cluster near the warmth of the ventilation exhaust. Rick realized that he had succeeded in creating a living heart for his mountain fortress. The greenhouse acted as a giant airlock. He could step out of the bunker into this garden to breathe clean air and see the sky, such as it was, without ever risking contamination. If he needed to scavenge again, he could suit up in the greenhouse and exit through the outer airlock, keeping the inner sanctum of the bunker pure. He looked at his hands, which were covered in cuts and chemical stains, and felt a profound sense of peace. He was alone in the world, perhaps the last man to ever plant a seed, but he was no longer just a victim of the tide. He had built a wall. He had saved the bees. He had protected his dogs. As the wind continued to howl against the glass, Rick closed his eyes and listened to the hum of the fans and the breathing of the dogs. The world below was gone, submerged in a yellow silence, but here, on the highest peak of the Sawtooth, life was taking root. He had survived the rising line, and for the first time, he believed he could keep it that way. The weeks that followed the sealing of the greenhouse were defined by a strange, translucent isolation. Outside the thick, tempered glass, the world had ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The yellow fog had not receded. Instead, it had settled into a dense, semi-permanent layer that hugged the contours of the mountain like a heavy shroud. From the center of his garden, Rick could look out and see nothing but a glowing amber void. There were no horizons, no distant peaks, and no stars at night, only the relentless, swirling presence of the chemical tide pressing against his borders. Inside the glass, however, a miracle was unfolding. The combination of rich valley soil, constant water from the bunker's deep well pump, and the unwavering energy provided by the monocrystalline panels had turned the once sterile granite plateau into a lush, vibrant jungle. Rick moved through rows of vegetables with a pair of pruning shears, his movements slow and deliberate. The air inside the greenhouse was humid and smelled powerfully of damp earth, tomato vines, and the sweet, heavy scent of blooming squash. It was a sensory overload compared to the cold, metallic scent of the bunker's lower levels. Above him, the monocrystalline panels were mounted on adjustable internal racks just beneath the glass. He had realized early on that the fog outside diffused the sunlight, creating a bright but indirect light that was perfect for growth, but required the panels to be perfectly angled to catch every available photon. He adjusted the tilt of the main array, watching the digital readout on his wrist-mounted monitor. The efficiency of the monocrystalline cells was the only reason the fans were still turning and the heaters were still fighting off the high-altitude chill. The dog, Silas, and the younger hound had claimed the greenhouse as their primary territory. They no longer paced the cold concrete of the barracks. Instead, they spent their days lounging on patches of clover Rick had planted between the vegetable beds. Silas seemed younger here, his gray muzzle often dusted with the dark soil. He insisted on digging in whenever he thought Rick wasn't looking. They watched the bees with a sort of lazy fascination. The hive had thrived beyond Rick's wildest expectations. The bees had adapted to their glass-enclosed world, their golden bodies constantly darting between the yellow blossoms of the zucchini and the delicate white flowers of the pea vines. The low, steady hum of the colony had become the heartbeat of the bunker, a constant reminder that life was not just surviving, it was busy. Rick spent hours every day maintaining the equilibrium of his sanctuary. He had become an amateur chemist, a plumber, and an atmospheric engineer all at once. Every morning, he checked the seals of the airlock that led to the outside world. He would stand in the small, intermediate chamber, peering through the heavy porthole at the yellow soup beyond. The corrosive nature of the fog was a constant concern. He could see where the exterior frame of the greenhouse was beginning dull as the chemicals reacted with the protective coatings. He knew that eventually he would have to venture out to apply fresh neutralizer to the structure's exterior, a task that filled him with a cold, hollow dread. But for now, the pressure sensors indicated a perfect seal. The positive pressure system, powered by the auxiliary batteries, ensured that the clean, oxygen-rich air produced by the plants was constantly pushing outward, creating a barrier that the fog could not penetrate. In the late afternoons, when the amber light outside grew dim and the shadows of the vines lengthened across the granite floor, Rick would sit in his folding chair and record his observations in a leather-bound journal. He noted the growth rates of the various heirloom seeds, the behavior of the bees, and the power consumption of the climate control systems. He found himself writing to a future audience that he wasn't sure existed. He wrote about the taste of the first radish he harvested, crisp, peppery, and so full of life it had brought tears to his eyes. He wrote about the way the dogs looked when they were sleeping in the sun, oblivious to the fact that they were perched on the last habitable island in a drowned world. These entries were his anchor, a way to keep his mind from drifting into the same featureless void that lay outside the glass. One Tuesday, according to the calendar he kept on the bunker wall, the status of his sanctuary was put to its first real test. A high-altitude windstorm, a common occurrence in the Sawtooth, slammed into the peak with a violence that made the entire structure shudder. Even through the reinforced glass, the sound was deafening, a high-pitched shriek as the wind tore across the sharp edges of the granite. The yellow fog outside was whipped into a frenzy, roiling and spinning in great chaotic vortexes. Rick watched, his heart in his throat, as a piece of debris, perhaps a frozen branch or a shard of rock, was caught in a gust and hurled against the eastern wall of the greenhouse. The impact was a sharp, sickening crack that echoed through the garden. He lunged for his inspection light, his boots splashing through the irrigation runoff. He found the point of impact, a small spiderweb fracture in one of the lower panes. It wasn't a breach, but the structural integrity of the panel had been compromised. He could see the yellow mist swirling just inches away from the crack, almost as if it were trying to find a way to bleed inside. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a vacuum-rated patch kit from his emergency supplies, a specialized resin, and a secondary layer of clear polycarbonate. With steady hands, he applied the resin, watching it seep into the fractures before curing it with UV light. He reinforced the area with the polycarbonate sheet, bolting it directly into the aluminum frame. He didn't breathe until the pressure gauge showed that the seal was once again absolute. The storm lasted for 3 days. During that time, the sunlight was almost entirely blocked by the agitated fog, and the temperatures plummeted. Rick had to make the difficult decision to divert almost all the power from the monocrystalline panels to the internal heaters, letting the grow lights go dark to save the batteries. He huddled in the greenhouse with the dogs, wrapped in blankets, watching the frost creep across the corners of the glass where the heaters couldn't reach. The bees went silent, clustering together in a hive to protect the queen. It was a period of intense, frozen anxiety. Every creak of the metal frame sounded like a structural failure. Every gust of wind felt like the one that would finally shatter his world. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was different. The wind had cleared some of the fog from the immediate vicinity of the peak, revealing a jagged, surreal landscape of white frost and yellow residue. The sun, pale and distant, began to recharge the monocrystalline panels, and Rick felt a profound sense of relief as the heaters hummed back to full power. He spent the entire day cleaning the exterior of the glass using a long-handled squeegee through the airlock specialized port, clearing away the chemical soot that had accumulated during the gale. As the light flooded back into the garden, the plants seemed to reach upward, and the bees resumed their work with a renewed, frantic energy. The greenhouse had become more than just a source of food. It was Rick's psychological refuge. In the evenings, he would often leave the heavy iron door to the bunker open, allowing the scent of the garden to drift down into the lower concrete levels. It transformed the bunker from a tomb into a home. He spent his time building more permanent furniture from the crates he had brought up from Oak Haven, a sturdy table for his journals, a better bed for the dogs, and a workbench for repairing his tools. He even managed to rig a small shower system using a black plastic tank mounted at the top of the greenhouse, where the sun could warm the water during the day. Despite the relative comfort, the reality of his situation was never far from his mind. He was a man living on a timeline dictated by his supplies and the durability of his equipment. He knew that eventually he would run out of certain nutrients for the soil, or that a critical component of the ventilation system would fail beyond repair. He began to plan for the long term, experimenting with composting the plant waste and the dog's waste to create a self-sustaining nutrient cycle. He taught himself to harvest the seeds from the strongest plants, drying them and storing them in airtight containers inside the bunker's most stable environment. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a curator of life. One afternoon, while he was tending to the beanstalks, he noticed Silas standing at the glass, his hackles raised, staring intently into the yellow void. The dog let out a low, vibrating growl that Rick had only heard when there was a predator near the old cabin. Rick grabbed his binoculars and joined the dog at the window, his eyes searching the amber depths. At first, he saw nothing but the shifting patterns of the fog. Then he saw a movement, something large and dark passing through the mist about 50 yards down the slope. It was too large to be a bird and too fluid to be a rockfall. It moved with a heavy, lumbering gait, disappearing into the fog before he could get a clear look at it. The realization that something else might be alive out there, or that something had changed in the nature of the fog, kept him awake for nights. He began to wonder if the disaster had not just killed everything, but had perhaps altered the survivors in ways he couldn't imagine. He checked the perimeter sensors he had buried in the shale outside, but they remained silent. He increased the frequency of his inspections, double-checking every bolt and every seal. He realized that as much as the greenhouse was a sanctuary, it was also a target. To anything else left in this dying world, the light and heat emanating from his glass fortress would be a beacon. He decided he needed a better vantage point. Using the remaining aluminum struts in the greenhouse kit, he constructed a small, reinforced observation crow's nest atop the bunker's main air intake, accessible only from inside the greenhouse. From there, he could see over the top of the structure and get a 360-degree view of the plateau. He spent hours up there, wrapped in a heavy coat, watching the fog. He never saw the dark shape again, but the feeling of being watched never truly left him. It changed the way he lived. He became more cautious, more deliberate, and more aware of the fragility of his walls. As the months turned into a year, the greenhouse became a masterpiece of improvised engineering. Rick had integrated the monocrystalline panels into a smart grid that automatically shifted power based on the time of day and the intensity of the fog. He had expanded the garden to include a small patch of wheat and even a dwarf lemon tree he had found as a sapling in the distribution center. The bees were on their third generation, and their hive had grown so large that he had to split it, creating a second colony in another corner of the structure. The honey they produced was dark and rich, a luxury that felt like a relic from a forgotten civilization. The relationship between Rick and his dogs had evolved into something almost telepathic. They moved through the narrow paths of the greenhouse with a grace that avoided the delicate vines, and they seemed to understand the importance of the airlock and the sensors. They were his sentries, his companions, and his motivation. On the darkest nights, when the wind howled and the yellow fog pressed so hard against the glass that it seemed the structure might buckle, Rick would sit between them, his hands on her warm fur, and listen to hum of the life he had built. He began to think about the possibility of other peaks. If he could survive here, on this high ridge of the Sawtooths, surely others had found their own islands in the sky. He started using the bunker's old radio equipment, powered by a dedicated line from the monocrystalline panels, to broadcast a low-frequency signal into the void. He didn't know if anyone was listening, or if the signal could even penetrate the chemical interference of the fog, but he spoke into the microphone every night. He described his location, his success with the greenhouse, and the clean air of the peak. "This is Rick," he would say, his voice steady in the quiet of the garden. "I have air. I have food. I have the light. If you can hear me, climb higher. The tide is thick, but the sun is still here." He never received a reply, but the act of speaking into the dark gave him a sense of purpose that went beyond simple chores. He was a lighthouse keeper in a world without ships, a guardian of the last green thing in a yellow universe. He looked at the vines heavy with fruit and the bees, golden in the artificial light, and he knew that as long as the monocrystalline panels held the sun and the glass held the wind, he would keep the light burning. He was a master of the fog line, and he was not going anywhere. The dogs settled into clover. The bees hummed in the blossoms, and outside, the yellow void continued its restless, hungry swirl, forever denied entry into the sanctuary of the stone and glass. The weight of the silence outside was no longer a burden, but a testament to his victory. Every day that the plants grew and the dogs breathed was a day that the disaster had failed to claim the last of the world. Rick picked a ripe tomato from the vine, the skin warm from the internal heaters, and took a bite. The juice was sweet and sharp, the taste of summer that should have been forgotten. He looked at the monocrystalline panels, their dark surfaces gleaming with the reflected light of his home, and he smiled. He had turned the tomb into a cradle, and for the first time in a long time, he was at peace. He would keep the garden. He would keep the bees. He would keep the dogs. And he would keep the light, for as long as the mountain stood and the sun remained in the sky,